Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Justice, and it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to the start of MHS's ADHD webinar series, Unmasking ADHD, Practical Strategies to Empower Youth and Adults. We are thrilled to have you all here to kickstart our annual series, but first, we would like to take a moment to tell you about MHS. For over 40 years, MHS has provided trusted, data-driven solutions across our core disciplines: clinical, education, talent development, and public safety. Science and research are the basis of MHS's roots and future innovations. With advanced toolsets, we can help clients evaluate, track, and leverage human-centric data to help realize their full potential. MHS, through its collection of clinical assessments and solutions, specializes in aiding the identification and treatment of psychological disorders for improved patient outcomes at all stages of life. We also provide, through our education portfolio, expertise and resources required to help children and adolescents reach their full potential in and beyond the classroom. With our advanced suite of tools, team of experts, and robust data insights, we help clients provide comprehensive evaluations and uncover powerful insights. I would like to extend my heartfelt congratulations to Dr. Naglieri for winning the 2024 Excellence in Equity Industry Impact Awards as Author, Speaker, or Consultant of the Year for his exemplary work on the Naglieri General Ability Tests, which also earned the 2024 Excellence in Equity Industry Impact Awards in the Diversity and Inclusion Solution category. Your contribution to increasing fairness are truly remarkable. We'll start this webinar with a presentation by Dr. Jack Naglieri titled Executive Function, From Assessment to Intervention, a session that reflects on the definition of executive function and results from a recent national study using the Comprehensive Executive Function Inventory, also known as the CEFI. The CEFI is our rating scale to assess executive function strengths and weaknesses in individuals at the pediatric age. Now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Naglieri. Dr. Jack Naglieri is a highly respected psychologist and educator whose career spans over 4 decades of contributions to the field of cognitive assessment and educational measurements. He began his professional journey as a school psychologist in 1975 and earned his Ph.D. in 1979, later holding faculty positions at the Northern Arizona University, the Ohio State University, and George Mason University, where he is now emeritus professor. Currently serving as senior research scientist at the Devereux Center for Resilient Children, Dr. Naglieri has focused his work on developing tools that support accurate identification of students' abilities and practical applications in educational settings. Dr. Naglieri is the author of 23 books, 51 tests and rating scales, and over 300 research papers. His most recognized assessments include the Naglieri General Ability Tests, verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative, the Autism Rating Scales, the Comprehensive Executive Function Inventory, and the Cognitive Assessment Systems Second Edition. Dr. Naglieri has consistently emphasized the role tests play in accurate diagnosis, relevance to classroom intervention, and especially fair assessments based on sound theory. Through his research and development efforts, Dr. Naglieri has helped shape a more thoughtful and balanced approach to identifying intellectual strengths in students from a wide range of backgrounds. Now, over to Jack Naglieri.
Thank you for the nice introduction, Justice. And let's get started with executive function, from assessment to intervention, implications for differential diagnosis of ADHD, specific learning disabilities, and ASD. Please note on the bottom of this image is my email and my 2 web websites, jacknaglieri.com and naglierigifted-test.com. Everything on those 2 websites is free, so I encourage you to go there and poke around and enjoy. Obviously, I'm going to be talking about a lot of tests that I've built over the years. So there's my disclosures. Couple of things. I will be talking about the past theory of intelligence as it relates to ADHD and ASD and autism. If you would like to read this book, you can simply download it from using this QR code. University professors can also use the QR code to access free CAS2 materials for teaching. And if you're interested in neurodiversity, take a listen to my neurodiversity podcast. All right, so I mentioned the two websites. The one on the left has to do with my work with gifted, and the one on the right has to do more with my individual assessment work. Again, everything's free. Take advantage of those websites. But let's reflect for a moment. Why a session on EF? I think in a lot of ways that the EF or the executive function is probably the most important ability that we have, because it's all about helping us make decisions about how to do things, how to get things done, how to get around a problem, how to be successful. And the really good news is I've done a lot of research, which I'll share with you, that you can help children be more strategic. And I'll show you how. Now, let's start by talking, just refreshing a few things about ADHD, because we are going to be talking about that in particular. So obviously the DSM is kind of the focus point as it relates to ADHD. And we understand the two components, the inattentive and the hyperactivity. And of course, we are mindful that part of the criteria is that there be actual impairment. So that's why I've added the rating scale of impairment. Everyone might be take a minute to take a look at that. So this is the big context, and it's important to pause and think, well, attention, well, that's certainly a cognitive process. And being hyperactive, that's certainly also perhaps a lack of a cognitive process. We're going to talk about that today. Let's start by talking about ADHD, but I'm going to give you kind of a little bit of a preamble. I like this quote from Albert Einstein: what is right is not always popular, and what is popular is not always right. I am going to be sharing with you research findings that will challenge what you know to be true, but it really isn't. And it's hard to make that shift, especially when we've been thinking in a certain way, but the science has taken us in a different way. So I hope that you'll be open-minded to listen to the science and then be able to make some good decisions. I think everybody knows about Phineas and the accident, so to speak, that he experienced, and the real value from a scientific standpoint of this man's very unfortunate event was that it really helped us start to think about the frontal lobes as being really important. I remember many years ago reading neuropsych textbooks that said the frontal lobes had nothing to do with intelligence because Wechsler IQ scores didn't change after frontal lobe damage. That never felt right to me. We'll talk about that. But remember, Phineas, before he was very capable, but then after, his thinking was impaired, his actual behaviors were altered, his ability to work in social contexts was impacted, and his ability to actually do the work that he did previously, which was really an organizer of workers, he couldn't do that anymore. So why do I emphasize this? Because executive function plays into this topic because it's multidimensional in terms of the impact. But let's take it a few more steps. So it was Luria in the mid-60s who first started writing about this concept of executive function in his higher cortical functions book, which is that really big fat one, right? Nick Goldberg, have listed, shown here. Nick was a student of Luria's in Russia. Nick and I've go back a lot of years. I think his writing is absolutely terrific. He has a great way of writing that is so authoritative and yet easy to access. And it was Nick who I relied on a lot when we were building the cognitive assessment system. Now, let's talk about the frontal lobes and executive function. When Sam Goldstein and I decided that we were going to build our own rating scale of executive function, I said to Sam, you know, we are going to have to figure out, is it executive function or functions, plural? And I said to Sam, well, we're in a great position because we're going to be able to answer that question. Is it a unitary construct? Is it unitary with lots of parts, or is it different things? One of my colleagues talks about something like 40 different kinds of executive function. And other people say, no, it's just a function one thing. So the best way to answer this question is to do the science. So we're going to talk about EF, and we're going to be thinking about what we know about it in terms of its relationship to academics, social, emotional, and life in general. So this is my big picture of this presentation. We're going to come back to what executive function is in a minute. This is my big picture. This is really a simultaneous processing presentation here. What do we have at the base? Neurocognitive ability is the foundation. And then we have behaviors related to cognition, behaviors related to social emotional skills, and academic and job skills. All of these three components rest on neurocognitive abilities. So let's talk about each one in turn. Let's start by talking about the way that EF is often evaluated. So when I started to build my comprehensive executive function inventory, I said to Sam, I don't want to do it the way other people have done it. I don't want it to be bad items. I want us to measure items positively worded items. Instead of asking how often does the child fail, we're not going to do that. We'll talk about what the child is able to do. So all of our items are about being positively worded, and we have higher scores mean good executive function. And to make it even easier to compare to other things like IQ tests, we use a metric mean of 100 and ST of 15. I never liked really to use T-scores because they're too confusing, especially when a T-score of 50 is average and a percentile score of 50 is average. It just doesn't feel right to me. But anyway, so we created a child version, 5 to 18-year-olds, and then we created an adult version, and they were really based on the same basic collection of items. What did we do? We decided that we would have items that get at attention, items that get at emotion regulation, flexibility, inhibitory control, initiation, organization, planning, self-monitoring, and working memory. Those are the areas. You could think of them as subtests, really. But really what they are is a collection of items that are all, interspersed according across the whole scale. But here's the thing. Because we have a whole standardization, thousands of people who are rated by different raters, and the samples represent the US population, it's a perfect research study. So many times when I've published research on 100 kids, I say, oh, I wish I had a larger sample. Well, we did here. So what we decided to do was ask the question, is it executive function or functions? And we're going to ask it using factor analysis. But what we did is we first did an analysis using all the little items, and then on the second time we do these collections of items like subtests. So it's just different ways of asking the same question. So we had parent, teacher, and self, and then we had adult, self, and observer. And we asked the same question every single time and got the same answer. So this is roughly 7,000 ratings, people across the country, 8 to 88. And we always get the same answer. It's one factor, one dimensional. That means it's executive function, not functions plural. So what does that mean from a practical standpoint? Okay, well, we have a whole bunch of scores that correspond to all these different areas, but any one area alone is not going to lead you to say the child has an EF strength or weakness. I like to think of it as a minestrone soup. Being Italian, I have a minestrone example. It wouldn't say it's a tomato soup or a carrot soup or a pasta soup. It's the whole that makes it what it is. Same is true here. And what is the whole? What is the driver? It is when you ask yourself how I will be able to do whatever it is I decide I want to do. How you do what you decide to do. That's what our EF definition is all about. So EF is a unitary concept, one-dimensional. Now, does it involve initiating? Of course. Does it involve planning and organizing? Yes, and attending and remembering and flexibility and self-monitoring, self-regulation, and so on. All of these parts make up the whole, but one piece in particular is not going to define the person. Now, sometimes I hear people talk about executive functions as skills, especially when I see intervention programs and people write, teach these skills to make the kids better in executive function. And here's the thing. You have to decide what you mean a skill to be. So I went back to a book that I read in 1978. It's this book by Miller, Galanter, and Prebram. This is an amazing book, especially in that time period, that really brought us to this idea of the frontal lobes being so critical. And what they described was, they wrote this: skills are plans that were originally voluntary, but have become automatic once the plan that controls the sequence of skilled action becomes fixed through overlearning. So what does that mean? That means initially you figure out how to do what it is you want to do. But once you've figured it out, then you just do it each time. And when you're doing it each time, you're not really thinking about it, you're just doing. I like to render this concept with these two curves. Nick Goldberg actually gave me this idea in his book on the new executive brain. Nick says, a novel task demands a lot of cognition, a lot of thinking. But once the task is learned, it's requiring a lot of doing. Thinking versus doing. For example, when you drive your car, you're not thinking about how to make the car go faster or slower or to turn it. You did when you first learned, but you don't do that anymore. So that's where we are on this concept here. We're not going to be talking about executive function skills. Now, here's the thing as it relates to I want to talk a little about how you interact with students. Self-regulation, just to use it as an example, that's a very important part of success in a lot of ways. And we want our kids to be thinking about all that self-regulation. But we can't tell them. We need to encourage them. In other words, we're not going to be the child's frontal cortex. But how do we make that happen? I'm going to show you with my intervention research in a few minutes. Let's take another step now, and let's ask a related question. Given the importance of this concept of EF, frontal functioning, right? Should it be included in an intelligence test? Well, it's not included in any traditional intelligence test, that's for sure. Should it be? In my opinion, absolutely. But let's pause for a second and reflect on the history of our intelligence test. We're looking at 5th editions of our intelligence test these days. We got to have a historical perspective on all this. Let's go back and reflect on Binet for a minute. The last 2 editions of Binet's scale were really interesting. When Binet was creating the 1911, his final one died shortly thereafter. He took out of the previous 1908 edition any questions that demanded too much on school learning, because he saw that was a confound in measuring intelligence. Now, Terman comes along, and I think Terman, like a lot of people at that time, they were just pulling stuff out of the air, but he, in his own way, thought that intelligence at the verbal and abstract level is the highest form of mental ability. Okay, it sounds a little elitist, but that was Terman. But here's the thing. Terman had a student, Arthur Otis, of the Otis Lenin. But something more important, Otis was the driver behind the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. And if you know your history, there was a man who used the Army Alpha and the Army Beta to create his intelligence test, and that was David Wexler. Wexler was not creative. I mean, if you look at the original Wexler value and even the current Wexlers, they have the Army mental test items all over them. That's where Wexler got his ideas. You can see whose book I made a copy of. And think of all the other tests then that kind of cascaded after that. All the same, but there's no EF here. Because there's no theory. Rudolf Pittner is one of my heroes, psychological heroes. I love this quote of his: "We did not start with a clear definition of general intelligence, but borrowed from everyday life a vague term implying all-around ability and was still attempting to define it more sharply." Wow, is that ever true? And endowed with a stricter scientific connotation. Is that ever true today as it was in 1923? Rudolf Pittner was a professor at Ohio State University. So was I. Rudolf Pittner was a professor whose office was in Arps Hall. So was mine. I don't know. It's kind of spooky, but fun. I think Pittner was right on target. And then we have Edwin Boring, unfortunate last name for a great writer of history. But what did he say? We cannot measure intelligence when we have never defined it. But I think it's important to ask the question, can we pull out executive functions somehow if we think about working memory? If we use like a working memory score from someplace, or a processing speed, or this or that or the other thing. What does the science tell us? This is the part that gets a little complicated. How do we answer that question? How do we answer the question, can we pull out things like executive function from traditional IQ tests? Well, a lot of people would encourage you to do that. I follow the science. And the science I'm going to talk to you about is this analytic way that's called bi-factor analysis. Now, there's a whole big literature on this. If you don't know it, I'm going to show you a lot of research studies you should go read. Don't take my word for it. Go read them all. But what the bi-factor analysis does, it examines the amount of information subtests and scales provide above and beyond the total score. In other words, the total score represents G. And then that information is used to guide, to answer the question, should you interpret a subtest or a scale from test X, Y, or Z? That's the concept behind the bi-factor analysis. So really, it's about the validity of the interpretation of tests that we've used forever. I mean, I've been doing this for 50 years, and I've watched the progression from the whisk to where we are today and the original Binet. But here's a very sobering start to what's going to get even bigger. So just going to use this as a way of really explaining more of the bi-factor analysis. So the image on the left, structural validity of the WISC-5, confirmatory factor analysis, 16 primary and secondary subtests, blah, blah, blah. What did they find? The small portions of variance uniquely captured by subtests render group factors scales of questionable interpretive value independent of G. In other words, G is supported, interpretation of the parts is not. Same thing for the study on the right-hand side. The results indicate that most cognitive abilities specified by John Carroll, that's the CHC stuff, has little to no interpretive relevance above and beyond that of general intelligence. Wow. Okay, but this is 2 studies. Well, not really. So I went to the literature and I looked up a lot of different studies from a lot of different tests. WISC-5, WACE-4, WISC-4 Spanish, WISC Canadian, Stanford Binet, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And what did we find? The subtests and scales have little to no interpretive relevance above and beyond that of general intelligence. What this means is the only score you should interpret is the full scale score. What you've been taught to do as a good clinician is not supported by the science. It's not my science. I'm reporting what other people have shown. A lot of different people, a lot of different authors, a lot of different tests. And that's what's been found. This really is a problem for our field, because how many books are there that tell us 101 ways to interpret block design? the science isn't there. Only support for G. There is one exception. So 2011, Gary Canavay published this paper on my cognitive assessment system. And what did he find? He found that the subtests had enough variance to be interpreted, the PASS scales to be interpreted. Okay, that was on the original CAS. That was one study. Ryan McGill presented this paper. This is actually from NASP, and I know it's submitted for publication. And what did Ryan, he used a slightly different methodology, but basically getting at the same question as bifactor. The current study found the indicators were consistently aligned with the way the test is organized. You can interpret PASS. Okay, so that's two studies. Then this study was just appeared like last week in the journal Assessment, which I think is the premier assessment journal, by Timos and George. And what was found was that the PASS scores have sufficient specific variance to be interpreted. And then here's another study that just got submitted for publication by Nicholas Frost. He analyzed the Scandinavian version of the CAS2 and found the same result, supported the multidimensional nature of the CAS2. That is, the CAS2 is more than G, and it can be interpreted. These results indicate that the CAS2 is psychometrically sound. Why is this important? Because CAS2 can measure executive function directly and complement what you get from a rating scale. That's where we're going here. All right, so the question is, if we have all these factor analytic studies that show that the CAS4 scores can be interpreted, does that mean that we might get profiles for kids? Because that's what we're all about now, right? Pass the profiles of strengths and weaknesses. Well, and we would anticipate that the previous, the other IQ tests out there would probably not work because they don't have specific variance. But let's see what we get in terms of profiles. So now this is kind of a busy image. This is related to a paper that Tulio Otero and I published not too long ago. I think we were in Psychology in the Schools. It's kind of hard to see, it's a little small on the bottom there. But what is this? So these are results from the various test manuals and whatever what else we could find. And we simply plotted the average scores for the scales that these tests yield for kids with ADHD, kids with autism, and kids with dyslexia. So let's just walk through from left to right. WISC-5, I don't really see much there. WJ-5, not really seeing much there. KBC, very disappointing. Just elevation differences, pretty much like the Stanford-Binet. Differential ability scales, nothing happening there. RIAS, not much happening there. But look what happens on the CAS. Kids with ADHD have executive function failure. And what are they low on the CAS? Planning. That's our executive function concept, frontal lobes. Kids with autism are low on attention. That's exactly what authors from our assessment of autism book recommended, that these individuals, although they can focus really well, they can't shift. And that's why they get a low score on the attention scale, the CAS. And the dyslexic kids are the ones who fail with reading to coding. They can't work with information in order, and that's why they have low successive processing score. So the reason the CAS yields distinctive profiles is because of the factor analytic results that says you can interpret these scales. And the reason that these others don't work is because they don't have enough specific variance to make it happen. All right. A related topic, sometimes people have asked me, well, do you get consistency in profiles over time, or in it, if you look at the profile today or tomorrow? Yes. Well, this is a study that Tulio and I did, where not only did we test the kids over time, we also tested them in different languages. The English and the Spanish version, over 90% of the decisions made on the basis of the profiles were the same. So we have stability of the profiles. Let's now that I've given you kind of a tickler about PASS, let's take a look at this, and I want to explain really how it fits into EF and why it's a critical part of an evaluation when you're trying to determine if a child has an executive function failure. I'm going to emphasize something right here. And a rating scale alone is not enough. I'm going to say that again. My opinion is that when you're doing an evaluation of a student and you're trying to determine if they might have an executive function weakness, just having a poor score on a rating scale is not sufficient. You need to do more than that. You need to have a direct measure of the student's ability to think in a way that's defining what executive function is, how to do what you choose to do. So that brings us to this work that I did on cognitive assessment system, where with my colleague J.P. Das, this is our first meeting back in 1984. Yeah, been working on this for a while. We published the first edition of the CAS in 97, the second edition in 17, and we're still out there talking about it and showing how powerful this really is. But what are we getting at with these four basic psychological processes? Is right out of neuropsychology. It's right out of Luria, and where our goal is to measure thinking, 4 different kinds of thinking in a way that's not confounded by what a person knows. For example, if you give a child a similarities subtest on the WISC, in what way are a fly and a tree alike, or whatever question, human, right? That's an analogy. But it also is a lot of verbal concepts and all that kind of stuff that's involved to answer that question. But let's look at this question here. So in order to answer the question, you need to understand the relationship of the circles and the squares to arrive at the answer, which is obviously number 2. Now, let's look at another problem with exactly the same structure. Girl is to woman as boy is to man. Here's another one that's a little bit more knowledge-based. 3 is to 9 is 4 is to 16. Now I'm going to give you another one that I bet no one can answer. Same exact structure. C7 is to F is E7 is to. If anyone's a musician, you'll know the answer just like that. The answer is A. So with the cognitive assessment system, what we want to do is we want to measure thinking in a way it's not confounded by knowing. So that means we had to build tests that would measure a certain way of thinking. And the ways of thinking were defined by our theory, which we call PASS, for planning, attention, simultaneous, and successive. Planning and attention is not measured by any other test of intelligence. Successive a little bit, simultaneous a little bit, but not very well. Just very briefly, you can measure PASS a lot of different ways. We have a 20-minute version, a 40-minute version. We have a digital version that's about to come out in the next couple of months. We have an extended version that has a lot of supplementary scores. But we measure planning. That's the EF piece, whether in all these instances. We have a Spanish edition. So we measure the basic way of thinking. That's the foundation of EF. Nobody else does it that way, but we do. And that's what makes the CAS so very important. So just to be clear, when we talk about planning, we're talking about thinking about how to do things. What decisions do you make? You try a solution. You look and see, can I do it a little bit better? You might say to yourself, oh, I got to slow down. I'm going too fast. I'm going to make a mistake. I'm going to lose my place. It's thinking about how to solve any kind of a problem. Of course, mathematics, written composition, learning a language, learning anything. There's a lot of EF. Now, how do we measure it? We measure it in tasks that are basically easy to do, and we allow the child to complete the task in any way they want. So like, for example, you can understand what the child has to do here. It's basically coding from the WISC, right? Only I changed it around and I made a critical alteration to the instructions. After we explain what the child has to do, we say to the child, you can fill it out any way you want. So the child who's being strategic does the A's and then the B's and then the C's. Simple as that. It's very powerful, but very simple. Attention, I'm only going to show you one subtest from each of these just because of the interest of time. Attention is all about finding a certain number in a certain in a certain font. And we have ways of priming kids to make it a lot more demanding. Simultaneous processing is about understanding interrelationships. And so we use matrices like the example I just gave you, right? But we made it richer by bringing in a verbal test. So think about that for a second. Matrices and verbal spatial relations go on the same scale. A verbal test and a nonverbal test. How is that? Because verbal and nonverbal is a description of the content of the questions, not some kind of magical thinking or some magical ability people think that you have. It's all about understanding interrelationships of the parts. Which picture shows the ball under the table? Simple. Very powerful. Successive is all about sequencing. We measure it with single syllable high imagery words like man, cow, key. But we also measure it with a visual digit span. So you see what we're doing now? We're doing auditory, we're doing visual, and then we're doing a syntax test. So for the older kids, we say the red, green, the blue with the yellow. Who got greened? This is really different, right? And what are we doing here is we're getting at the child's ability to think in certain ways using different content. So successive processing is not part of EF. Simultaneous processing is not part of EF. Planning is certainly part of EF. And that's what we're going to be emphasizing. So when you think about the kinds of tests that we measure, clearly we're getting at EF with planning. And some people put attention with that, and I'm okay with that if that works. We have an EF scale on the CAS that combines planning and attention. All right. Now, I'm going to start to talk to you a little bit more about intervention, but I'm going to encourage you to go to this website, efintheclassroom.net, because you can get there lesson plans written by teachers that help kids understand the value of being strategic about what they do. So here's how this came about. I gave a talk on EF some years ago at Learning the Brain, and one of the teachers there contacted me, wanted to ask me questions. Turned out we lived 15 minutes apart. So we started working together on these lesson plans, and the school that we worked at was an alternative high school. And the teachers were teaching these lesson plans, each one of these, one every week. And they found tremendous success, and they saw amazing changes in the way kids, young adults actually did what they did. Really, and it's all free. It's all there, all the lesson plans. I encourage you, if you're working in, especially in middle school, and you have those kids that are kind of all over the place, they pay attention to this because it's really awesome. By the way, in my book, Helping Children Learn, we have a lot of handouts for students. And we often pull out this particular one and scotch tape this little image, think smart and use a plan, to the kid's desk as a reminder. Think smart, use a plan. That's how you help kids. Why do I say that? Because of this study. Now, I have a whole line of research on intervention in this area. This is I think, the best study. It's also Jackie Eisman's dissertation, published in the journal Learning Disabilities. So what was it? It was a study of kids who had ADHD and LD, and they were randomly assigned to an experimental or a control group. And the way that this intervention was presented was that teachers had, if they were in the experimental group, the teachers would ask questions of the students after having the students do worksheets, math worksheets. What was your goal? Where did you start? What will you do next time? And the kids would hear what other kids say, and it's a learning experience, like a group experience. The control group got more math instruction by the regular teacher. And there's a whole list in the article. You can get the article on my website. There's a whole list of strategies that the kids presented us with, and they shared them with us. A lot of it was about self-monitoring. A lot of it was managing. I do the easy ones first and all that kind of stuff. Try not to fall asleep. Some kid had a good sense of humor. But here's what we found. The normal instruction kids improved a little bit, 0.6 effect size. It's not bad. The kids who got this planning facilitation, it was only a dozen 15-minute sessions. They improved dramatically. But we asked if it generalized to anything. Well, it generalized to Wyatt numerical operations, the experiment group much better than the control group. Also, math fluency on the WJ. And a year later, we went back to the school and we pulled out the achievement levels of the students a year later, and the experimental group was still better than the control group. So we got far transfer and it lasted a year. And all we did was talk to the kids and remind them, think smart, use a plan. By the way, when we looked at the profiles of the kids, we found the kids who were low in planning improved the most. In other words, cognition predicted response to intervention. My behavioral friends don't like it when I talk about that. Here's some of the other research out there. Go to the Essentials book, an inexpensive book, get it. There's a whole lot of information there. I encourage you to look at it. So basically what we're doing when we put EF, when we find out EF is a weakness, what we're saying is it's a cognitive processing weakness. But we're also going to have strengths, and we're going to have academic skills weaknesses. So at the base of this triangle answers the question why the kids fail. And at the top, the strengths. And PASS is a strength-based model. You can get a free analyzer on my website. Everything I've told you today is free. So go to my website. You just download the spreadsheet. You put in the numbers. And you get the triangle in no time. It's really, really awesome. All right. Now, let's think about EF as it relates to social emotional skills. Remember Phineas? He wasn't a very nice guy after the accident. He was described as being rude and inappropriate, and well, you know, you don't have much of a frontal lobe. What do you expect, right? The guy was really super impaired. And the connectivity between frontal lobes and emotion is nicely brought out in Steve Pfeiffer's books. I encourage you to read, and also, again, Nick Goldberg's book. You know, a lot of the emphasis on frontal lobe research, I think, points to the importance of the emotional piece as well as specific academics. So keep that in mind. And also keep in mind that if you need to calibrate social emotional strengths or needs or weaknesses, you can do that with this scale that Paul LaBeouf and Val Shapiro and I published some years ago, to actually calibrate it so that you can put everything, you know, in that triangle. All right. Now, I think we're doing good on time. Let's talk about a little bit about EF in the classroom. What kinds of tasks are going to demand EF? Certainly written composition. When the teacher says write a persuasive, you know, argument of blah, 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 that takes a lot of thinking and a lot of strategizing, and you have to come up with a plan and then sequence everything and review it and go back, right? All that kind of work. That's EF in action, but also attention, simultaneous, and successive. But the dominant driver is planning, is EF. Why do I say that? Because you're writing a story. So you get it all written, and then what do? You have to decide what to do next. I'm done. What do you say? I think I'm going to go for a walk and then come back and read it and see how it looks then. So that's a strategy. Right? That's using your EF to ensure that what you've done is good. And then oftentimes when you come back, you say, I can make it better. That's what we want. Now, Steve Pfeiffer and I have on the analyzer, like this is the analyzer for the Pfeiffer assessment of reading, of math rather. On each one of them, we have this crosswalk between PASS and different academics. So that'll kind of help you put all the pieces together. So that's something to keep in mind. All right. Now, another bit of validity. Does EF relate to achievement? Of course, it'll relate to some kinds of achievement tasks more than others. But in this study that we did with 1,600 children, we found, yes, it's very clear that there's a strong relationship between executive function and achievement. Now, I will tell you that the correlation between PASS and achievement is 0.72. So by just looking at half of PASS, you get a 0.5, which is like what you typically get, but when you add the other two, it's higher than any other instrument. And that's what George Giorgio and his colleagues found. That the correlations are significantly stronger than the correlations reported for previous meta-analyses for all other measures of intelligence. And they went on to say, if we conceptualize intelligence as cognitive processes linked to the functional organization of the brain, it leads to significantly higher correlations to achievement. Now, I'm saying to you that all these things go together, right? And it's kind of almost confusing. You mean social, emotional, and academics and cognition? How could they all be the same? Because they're all different things. Well, they're not really. Because look at this. I think this is really interesting. If you look at the CEPI, the EF rating scale, we get differences between males and females by parent or teacher raters. But clearly, females are better than males. When we look at the DESSA, social emotional measurements, females are better than males. When we look at PASS, we see planning and attention, EF, females better than males, simultaneous and successive, identical, virtually identical. That's really crazy. Because you got to get your head around this. Why is this? It's because the concept of executive function is driving the CEPI, the DESSA, and half of the CAS. So when I say they're the same, getting the same differences is just another way of saying, that's what I'm saying, that's why that's the same. There's a reason for it. All right, so now, just some conclusions. And assessment of ADHD should include examination of executive function behaviors, cognition, social, emotional, and academic skills. I think it's very positive that we can encourage the use of EF, and it really has an impact. You know, I only showed you that one study. We have a whole line of studies that shows that that's the case. I really think of it as the gift of smarter thinking. It's really nice. And it's a gift of optimism and a gift of life success, really. So that's what I love, this whole topic of EF. But here's the thing. It really requires you to shift your thinking based upon the science. Now, I know that this is not easy to take, to be told what you've been taught and what you've been doing, what I was taught, what I did is inconsistent with the science we have today. We do what we were taught, we did in the past what we were told and expected was reasonable to do. When the science comes up, we have to accept it. There's a quote that I heard Neil deGrasse Tyson say, one of the greatest challenges we have today is to know enough about a topic to think you're right, but not enough about the topic to know you're wrong. That's a powerful statement from Tyson's. And that's really what we're faced with. We're faced with a decision of how do we let the past go so we can build on what we know now and make it better for the kids that we're trying to help. And so with that, I'm going to finish up by saying, number one, you can always be in touch with me. You know how to find me. And I'm going to end with a song. I heard a song in a movie recently, and I'm just going to play a little bit of it. It goes like this. Maybe it's time to let the old ways die. Maybe it's time to let the old ways die. Takes a lot to change, and it takes a lot to try. Maybe it's time to let the old ways die.
I will now go on to questions. Our first question here today is, does executive function differ across the lifespan?
Thanks, Justice. I don't have all the information, but one thing I can say is when we were developing the CEFI and the CEFI adult, it was actually very, very interesting to see that the exact same structure applied for youth and for adults throughout the whole lifespan. The nuances change. You might frame an item or see a detail show up in a different way. You might talk about turning in schoolwork on time versus meeting deadlines in a workplace. But really, the structure of executive functioning is pretty consistent across the lifespan, and the two measures are quite parallel so that you can actually use it for continuity of assessment throughout somebody's life.
That's great. Thank you so much, Joanna. We have another question here. In addition to rating scales, what would you recommend to use to evaluate executive function?
Sure. As Jack mentioned in his talk, some of these performance-based tests really do require that demonstration of thinking skills. There's ability tests where test takers actually reason through what he was showing, like a matrix of images and shapes, or place items or images into a sequence to tell a story. So these kind of ability-based measures provide a lot of insight into an individual's capacity to think and reason and solve problems. And I think that would be a really excellent complement to a rating scale. Whereas the rating scales are a really good way to provide insight, especially from the self-report or somebody who knows the person well, about how those skills translated to daily life, whether they're meeting deadlines, whether they're having trouble remembering where they left their keys, whether they can plan steps to achieve a goal, to take an action, to follow instructions. I think it really builds together and adds a much more comprehensive picture when you're not using rating scales alone or performance measures alone, actually.
Thank you so much. Our next question is, how often can you re-administer rating scales of executive function like the CEFI or CEFI adult?
Sure. The recommendation I'll make is that it's a 4-week administration period. And what I mean is that the time frame for giving a response to each item asks you to reflect on the previous 4 weeks. And that was chosen to give a concrete boundary so you can actually pinpoint examples and think more specifically rather than abstractly, and be precise and provide reliable ratings of someone's behavior. It also means that a teacher in the youth version, or a parent or somebody who knows the person well, actually has sufficient opportunity to observe all these kind of behaviors in the past month. So that's the minimum typically. If I were to reassess it, I think at least 4 weeks would be my advice. You don't want to overlap between that time period. I know some people use it with kind of scheduled periodic reviews, maybe once a year, every 6 months, just as like a way to check in and track progress. I think it may depend on the use case. You might want to re-administer the test when you expect a large change might have happened, like as a response to treatment or as a result of an intervention, to see if you can actually monitor, show improvement, measure that change. So the re-administration may vary, but certainly at least 4 weeks apart would be my bare bones recommendation.
Thank you so much. Our next question is, how can you use testing to tease out ID, ADHD, and ASD?
What an interesting question, because those are so overlapping in kind of their transdiagnostic symptomology. And they're obviously quite distinct, but they really do co-occur quite often and blend together. My advice would be to use more than one indicator. So you might use something like the CEPI, which would certainly flag executive function challenges or strengths, areas that might need to be improved, areas that are causing impairment. But that alone isn't going to tease it apart. And so you might need to have other measures, like, for example, with youth, the Conners 4 to identify ADHD symptomology. The Autism Spectrum Rating Scales, the ASRS, is excellent for youth to think about autism-specific symptoms and features and associated challenges. And having a number of measures lets you triangulate and kind of see where the biggest challenges are, where you might want to focus your attention. And these things may be co-occurring. This is not unlikely. But I think having a more nuanced picture, collecting more information, certainly observation and interviews along with all the record review and these measures would really help paint a much more comprehensive picture.
Thank you so much. We have a question here that's, do you offer any scales or measures for adults?
Yes. I don't know if it was mentioned explicitly here, but the CEPI adult is something that we offer as well. So the CEPI is for youth up to age 18, and then the CEPI adult is 18 plus, and it covers the whole lifespan. And that's a really valuable tool because of the kind of natural cognitive decline that happens in old age. The CEPI adult goes to very, very high age range, even as a normative sample, which is so important to kind of track that developmental picture even later in life. We also, I mean, this isn't executive function exactly, but the measure of ADHD that we sell for adults is the CARS, the Conners Adult ADHD Rating Scale, the 2nd edition. And that does include an extensive executive functioning scale that I would recommend for use, especially in older adults as well. It has a really nice wide age range there.
Thank you so much. How easy is it to differentiate between ADHD and executive function difficulties?
Ooh. I mean, it's never easy. It is a hallmark feature of ADHD to have executive function difficulties. It is absolutely one of the things that is included in measures of ADHD. As like I just mentioned with the CARS 2 or even on the Conners 4, executive function is a key component of understanding the nature of ADHD. It varies person to person, and I think there's aspects of executive function that might be stronger or more impaired by the ADHD, and that is an interesting variety of something that the CEPI might be able to give you perspective on, which areas are strengths. So you might find in ADHD, you might have a special challenge, especially have challenges with things like planning, organizing information, time perception, time management is a really big one. So I do think these two things often go hand in hand, and that's not a surprise, really. It's not that you need to tease them apart. It's sort of more a matter of being aware of how intertwined they are and how to support that and how to design treatment intervention that can build up those skills and accommodate the ADHD needs as a result.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Joanna. Thank you again to Dr. Naglieri for giving an informative presentation today. I'd also like to thank all our attendees who joined us today. If we did not get to your questions in this webinar, please send us an email at marketing@mhs.com and we'll forward your questions along to Dr. Naglieri or MHS staff. As a reminder, you will receive a copy of the webinar recording in a few weeks. Thank you so much.